So, in this unit, I want to talk about the question of the duty to obey the law and civil disobedience. Um, Now, before we get started with this, I think we have to be careful and be very precise, very clear in what we're talking about when we talk about a duty to obey the law. So, when we say, is there a duty to obey the law, we don't want to confuse it with some pretty similar questions. Um, one similar question might be, should you do what the law tells you to do, right? Um, a lot of things go into that. One of them might be the duty to obey the law, the other one being, well, you might get caught and punished, right? You might also think, well, there's a lot of things the law forbids that no decent person would do, right? Rape, murder, things like that, right? Those are immoral, those are wrong no matter what. It would be a really weird person who would say, well, why don't you murder other people? And they say, well, because it's illegal, right? Um, what we're interested in is this question: does the fact that something is illegal or morally required give you a reason to do it over and above other reasons you might have? So, best way to put this: are we morally required to do what the law says simply because it's the law? Is it wrong to break the law simply because it's the law? Um, Let me give you guys some examples of when this question might arise, right? Let's say that you are 20 years old, 11 months, and 20 some odd days, right? Now, look, no magic happens when you turn 21 from like 20 and 90 some percent of 21 to 21, right? It would be illegal for you to drink at 20, it's legal at 21, right? Would it in some sense be wrong for the 20-year-old, 11 months and however many days person to drink simply because it's illegal for her to do so, right? Or let me give you guys another example. Say maybe you think this, maybe you don't, but if you do think that marijuana should be legal, if you think that there's nothing particularly morally wrong with smoking marijuana, with using this drug, does the fact it's illegal give you a moral reason not to do it? Let's say you could drink, you could smoke marijuana, not get caught. Does the fact it's illegal make it in any sense immoral, make it in any sense wrong for you to do it, even though it wouldn't otherwise be wrong? Um, one final example, and an example of why this is important, imagine that we had the draft. I mean, we don't anymore, but, men still have to sign up for the selective service. Imagine that we had the draft. They make us sign up for selective service in case they want to bring it back, right? Imagine we had the draft. There's a war going on. You're not sure about the morality of the war. You're just not sure what to think. But the government says, oh, you've been drafted. You have to go fight, right? Does the fact that the government tells you you need to go fight this war give you a moral reason to do it? You aren't sure otherwise whether there's a good moral reason. Government tells you to. Does that mean suddenly you have a duty to go fight this war? So hopefully this is clear on what we mean by a duty to obey the law, right? A lot of times we have a reason to obey the law because we don't want to go to jail, we don't want to get fined, right? A lot of times, in fact, I would think most cases, the things the law tells us not to do would be immoral even if the law didn't say anything about them, right? Things like rape and murder, right? But in cases where we think it wouldn't otherwise be immoral to do this thing, but it's illegal, does the fact it's illegal give us a moral reason to think it's wrong to do it? Or if the law tells us we have to do something that we wouldn't otherwise think we're in any way obligated or have to do, does the fact the law tells us we have to do it give us a reason to do it? So why is this question important? Now, I hope you guys can already get a sense of why this is important. Talking about draft cases, right? You know, drugs, alcohol, whatever. But when we talk about people being asked to go fight, to possibly go kill, maybe even die themselves, do they have to be convinced of the morality of the war, or is it enough that their state thinks that they need to fight, right? Lots of other cases, though, where we might think that the law asks something of us that's inconvenient or just plain silly, or maybe even horribly wrong, right? And in these cases, if we could get away with breaking the law, would it be wrong to do so? So here are some examples of laws that either are pretty clearly horribly immoral in the case of the so-called Jim Crow segregation laws, or at least that some people have found objectionable, right? The draft for the Vietnam War. A lot of people thought the war was immoral. A lot more people thought that even if the war might not be clearly immoral, the way the draft was administered was unfair, right? For a lot of the war, you had these draft boards. The draft boards often would decide who gets drafted in a very, well, another way to put this, very classist and racist way, right? I remember my own family telling me about the draft board in my hometown. It was always the working class kids who got drafted, never the well-off people. Somehow, always a reason to draft the working class kids, never a reason to draft like the factory owner's son, right? So you might think that the draft for the Vietnam War, there's no good reason to fight the war. You might think that the draft is unfairly administered. If you got drafted, though, do you still have a reason to fight? Especially when there are ways to avoid it, right? One common way to avoid it was to go to Canada. You have to live in Canada, which I'm told isn't that bad, but you wouldn't have to go to Vietnam, right? Another case, and we'll talk about this, the segregation laws in the South, the so-called Jim Crow laws, right? Horribly unjust, segregated schools, segregated spaces, one space for whites, one space for blacks. The space for blacks was always really inferior to the one for whites, be it schools or whatever. This is really unfair, right? Is there any moral reason to follow these laws? What would have to be the case for it to be justified to break these laws? Some more modern cases. The Kate Baker case in Colorado, right? There's an anti-discrimination law. He is a conservative Christian. He says, the law says you have to serve everyone. You have to bake cakes for everybody, among other things. He says it would be against his religion to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Well, is he morally justified in not following the law? Should we let him as a society out of following this law, right? Another case, government support for some kinds of birth control. Some religious groups might find this objectionable. This was part of Obamacare. Do they have a leg to stand on to not follow this law? Should we as a society let them out of it? Hopefully, this gives you guys a sense of why this is an important question.